Christianity being true. And my own view is I like to think about it in concentric circles. So I think what's quite probable, a bunch of clues point to God, a bunch of facts of reality like the origin of the universe, fine-tuning, the moral law, several things I think point to God. And then the next circle in makes it even, I think, Christianity more probable. So I go to the very probable category. From quite probable, now I'm at very probable. Very probable is Christianity. So basically what I've done is, remember I have three major moves. One is scientific facts, morality, facts of the universe. The second major thing is Christianity itself. The first big chunk points to a theistic God who created the universe, and only that. All those first 10 things did not get you to Jesus. It didn't get you God the Father, Son, and Spirit. It gets you to an all-powerful creator, good God. This second one, the very probable, points to Christianity in particular, instead of Islam or Mormonism and so forth. The third thing I have, which we'll do next week, which is direct evidence, and that certainly gets Christianity right on. So those are three major categories. So now we're on the very probable. This was last week. We talked about manuscripts. If you remember, manuscripts are the papyrus, the things where we get our Bible from. That's these, and I'm going very fast. If you were here last week, this can be lightning fast. But does this look familiar at all? The actual papyrus. We talked about how manuscripts. There are a lot of very, very ancient manuscripts. They come from different regions and all kinds of translations. It's not the telephone game. When we find early fragments, like on the right side, that are earlier than the fuller treatments, the earlier ones link up to the later ones. They're not perfect. They have spelling errors and typos, but it demonstrates that farther back in time we go, it's not wildly different stories. Like Jesus and Mary are married and have babies and none of that nonsense. In fact, there is a text that, well, never mind, that's it. So the more we find these fragments, they line up by content really well to what we already know. There's no major gaps, like these are gaps at the bottom of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember I talked about that, holes at the end of a text? Those lacunae, those gaps. Well, that's what it looks like when you transcribe it, all the empty space, because we have no idea what it says, because they're why? There are holes. That's not what we have in the New Testament, anywhere, except maybe the ending of Mark. Outside of maybe the ending of Mark, everything else, there are no major gaps. So there's no major lacunae or gaps. There are variants. There are differences in the copies. We can spot them all the time. In scholarship, we study them. There's no surprises. And about 99.9% of them are completely irrelevant. Most of them are spelling errors. Most of them aren't even translatable. And so we get down to a handful, maybe 10 or 11 or 12 maybe spots. And of those 10 or 12 spots that are meaningful and viable, really about 4 or 5 are a little more significant. Like the ending of Mark, the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53-11, things like that. But none of them affect doctrine. None of them affect any central claim whatsoever in Christianity. Just nothing. So they are variants. And, well, David, what do I do with that? Well, it means we're not exactly certain of what the exact word or phrase would be in certain text. Why is that? Because what happens is when we get these certain texts like Mark 1:1, when it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, if your good translation puts in brackets or parentheses or a footnote. Some ancient manuscripts don't have it, Son of God. Some ancient manuscripts do. And when you have really good old manuscripts that disagree, we're kind of at a standstill. And so then scholars pick and choose based on certain factors. Sometimes it's a coin toss if it's really good, if it's tied. Some things are tied, and we're just not sure which one to pick. Most translations keep Son of God. Does that make sense? So there's no major gaps in the New Testament. There's no major holes. It's a way of saying, in your Bible, most good critical editions of the Bible now, when they have the footnotes, like it'll say, well, let's, real quickly, before we move on, real quickly, turn to John 7:53. John 7:53. Even a good Bible app might say this as well, but John 7:53. And I want to ask you if you have a bracket or a parentheses or a footnote or anything on that verse or the verse right before it. And if so, go ahead and tell me what it says. John 7:53. Anybody?
Mine just has a bracket, and it
has a bracket?
53, and it says they went each to his own house, and then there's nothing.
So it's missing.
It's not there.
What about 8:1? Is your 8:1 there?
Yeah. Then it starts with verse 1.
Mine says 53 at 8:1.
That's right. So your editors made that because it's a different story. That's right. Is there a footnote there at the story or an asterisk or something that tells you in your Bible? There's something special about that?
Mine has a line under verse 52. There's a line going across the page, and then in parentheses it says the earliest manuscripts, and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. A few manuscripts include these verses wholly or in part after John 7:36, John 21:25, and Luke 21:38, and or Luke 24:53. And then it's got chapter 8, and then verse 53, and it's in italics. They all went home.
Gotcha.
But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives.
So, and what kind of Bible is that? What edition? NIV Study Bible?
Yes.
So the editors, the manufacturer, the editors who put that Bible edition together told you exactly the variants, the different manuscripts. And it told you right then, this story is a floating story in the first few centuries of the New Testament, of the first century. I will say the modern era, but in the first few centuries, it seems to be a floating story. And it even told you, some manuscripts have this story in other parts of John. Some manuscripts have this story in Luke. Some manuscripts have it right here. In fact, if you take out this story, if you excise this story, 7:53 or 8:11, John flows perfectly. I mean, it really looks like the English and it just plop down. It doesn't flow well in the narrative or anything. So most editions like yours, John, is that the NIV Study Bible?
It's Life Application.
Life Application, which has some notes on it?
Got tons and tons of it.
Yeah, most of those kind of notes, the editors will tell you in a footnote or hey, this story, it might not have been there. That most scholars would say it wasn't there. It probably, because the most ancient testament, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, they don't have it. They come a little bit later. So it's not a secret because they tell you right there, John, this story is not there. Yeah.
I finally found it where it says the earliest manuscripts do not include this.
Earliest manuscripts do. And what translation is that?
And it's ESV.
The ESV, which is a good one. Yes, yours says the earliest manuscripts do not include it. So let you know. So again, that's one example. So if you have a decent Bible, they're going to tell you every time there's any kind of variant, they'll let you know. So here's my point. In any kind of decent Bible, the Bible as you have it, let's stick with the New Testament for now. The New Testament as you have it, including those little footnotes, between those two, you've got the New Testament as it was originally. It just means sometimes we're not exactly sure which story was there with exact wording. If that's bothersome for you to not have certainty, then you're going to have to process that emotionally because we do not have certainty. We do not know 100% exactly every word and every story. We just don't. We don't. The reason why we don't have the original manuscripts, we have copies of them. And that's it. What I'm saying to encourage you is your Bible will usually let you know. Some ancient manuscripts don't have that. And it doesn't happen often. That is meaningful. And when it's meaningful, the Bible will let you know. I'm going to move on very quickly. Is there any questions or comments about that so far from last week? Okay, so what's my big fat point so far? When we talk about the external data, this is what we're talking about, external data, it does not mean therefore Jesus is true. It doesn't mean therefore Christianity is true. Not yet. This is leading us somewhere. If someone said, why I believe in Christianity, you'd say, well, that's an old book full of translations billions of years ago. Well, no, that's not billions of years ago. No, it's not based on a lot of translations. That's a very common atheist thing and non-Christian. The Bible you have today is like 12 translations removed. That's absolutely false. The Bible as we have it today If you read into English, you're one translation away. The original in New Testament was Greek. And people who go to school like me learn the Greek. So it is not 12 translations away. They say, well, the copies, 1,000 years later. No, that's not true either. The copies we have come within, all of the good ones come within 100, 200 years of the original. Well, that's forever. Well, if that's forever to you, then what's there for? Well, it means I wouldn't trust it. Well, if that's true to you, I wouldn't trust anything in the ancient world, ever. Because when you compare that to Herodotus and all these other people, you get this kind of stuff. Right? Remember we were talking about the time gap? Some of these time gaps for 1,000 years. I mean, how do I know about Caesar Augustus? Because they come from sources 400 to 600 years after he lived. But no one doubts he existed and the basic truths of Caesar Augustus. The Bible comes within a real close frame. We're going to come back to this one in a second. So it doesn't prove it, but boy, it makes it a lot more likely. It makes it a lot more likely that the manuscripts can be trusted. Every word? No, not every word. We can't be 100% certain. But it makes it very likely we can trust what we have in the New Testament. Now I'm going to move. That's external. That's the stuff, the papyrus. Now I'm going to go inside. And of everything I've covered so far, this will probably sound the most normal. So if you made it this far, way to go. I'm going to focus on genre, narrative, and inside details. Now, since I'm focusing on the truth of claims of Christianity, I'll focus on the Gospels, mostly, since they tell us the most information about Jesus. Okay? I'm not going to focus on every single document of the New Testament. I'm zoning in on those documents, mostly, that tell us about Jesus. Otherwise, we would have a whole semester on this whole thing. We have very good reason to trust that, at least in general, the Gospels accurately represent the life and teaching of Jesus. Nothing I'm about to say makes it certain. I don't ever use that word. I told you I don't. Hey, I'm certain it serves pizza at Papa John's. Okay. But I mean, real specific, I don't use that word. But instead, it's very, very, very probable that Gospels can be trusted to tell us that Jesus, what he actually said and what he did. Now, I say that because if you ever talk to non-believers and they think the Gospels are full of errors and full of this, I don't debate all that up front. I say, maybe it is. What's your point? Well, why trust it? I say, because we have very good reason to trust at least the general reliability of the Gospels. And here I'm going to give you multiple reasons why. So my view, and it does not have to be your view, my view is that when we talk to a non-believer, we're trying to get the bare minimum. Can we at least get the bare minimum and then work to the maximum? Some people are different. Some people have the view you've got to go out the gate with a big bat that says it's inspired, it's the Word of God, and every bit of it's 100%, and I got to get you to think that first before you trust me and trust the Gospels. Some people have that view. I'm not one of them. My view is we start at baby steps and say, forget inspired, forget all the inerrant, forget all those words, those code words Christians use amongst themselves. Can we trust it historically to basically give us the basic outline of the life and teaching of Jesus? If that is true, it's enough for Christianity to be true. You see what I'm going with that? And that's what I'm doing right now. I want to give you what I think is, I'm about to give you, these are facts I'm about to show you. This is not like the clues. That's why I'm moving probability, and I'm giving you some stinking facts. Absolutely certain. And these certain things, okay, I shouldn't say that word. These things that are very, very, very probable make it much more likely. Okay, the first thing is when we talk about the Gospels are various forms of ancient bios, or biography. Bios is an ancient Greek word, ancient Greek genre, but it's the word for life. The life of Winston Churchill. They would have the life of Caesar Augustus, the life of so-and-so. There's a long history there. Because of time, I don't have time to go in the background. But there's a long history. But in general, most New Testament specialists in the world concur it is an ancient form of bios, written within the first generation of eyewitnesses. It doesn't mean every fact comes from an eyewitness. It means that the Gospels were written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. John might be the only exception. I don't think it is, but most New Testament scholars think it might be the only exception. Okay, let me say a couple things about that. And this is back to that chart I showed you earlier. So, for example, when you look at the time gap right here, this chart, time gap, if you can see that.
Went out.
Just kidding. I think this chord is, that's what it is. Come on, baby. Good. I won't touch it. The time gap is between when the author wrote a story and the earliest manuscripts that we have. The New Testament was written around AD 50 to 100. At the latest. That's at the latest. Well, let's assume it is the latest. The Gospels were written, everyone really agrees, I think it's earlier, but the latest, most scholars put the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, the Synoptics, are by early 80. They put John around 90. I think they're all wrong, those that say that. But let's say a late dating just for fun. So let's say Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, all those things are written within 40 to 60 years. Jesus died probably today, AD 30, around 3 p.m. April 3rd, AD 30. Today is the anniversary. And so that's AD 30, and you go another 30 years about, you've got the Gospel of Mark. Between 30 and about 60 years, you have all 4 Gospels written. That's within the lifetime of the people still alive. Other sources can't do that. They're all dead by the time they're sources. And that's important because of a lot of things. Okay, let me make this very clear. A couple of things that are really important. Number one, first of all, every single specialist in the field is convinced that Jesus existed. On YouTube, it's popular to think he didn't. They're called Jesus mythicists. There is one trained historian I know of in the world who thinks Jesus, well, he would say he existed. He thinks Jesus was an angel. He thinks Jews thought Jesus was an angel who gave visions of himself, and then he always lived in heaven as an angel. And the earliest Christians made up a story of that angel being an historical figure. Therefore, Jesus never really was an historical figure. But they wrote a story as if he was because they think he was an angel. His name is Richard Carrier. He has a PhD in history. Nobody is convinced in the world. There is no historian on the planet I've ever read or known that ever takes Jesus' mythicism seriously. That doesn't mean he can't make an argument. He does make an argument. I find it very unconvincing. I've heard and read, I've heard many of his debates with people and lectures. Every specialist, everyone who has any training in this ancient Greco-Roman world thinks that's nonsense. Jesus did exist. And nearly every historian would add that Jesus also lived in the first century Palestine. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Now, at minimum, you'd say that. Why is that? Because Tacitus, a Roman historian, says it. He gets his name wrong, calls him Crestus. Crestus died under Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Palestine. Why would Tacitus, a Roman historian, make that up? I mean, it's a certain fact of history that Jesus existed. Why would Tacitus say that? He was a Christian. What bias would he have to make that up? Now, Jesus mythicists, that he never existed, he was a myth, are popular on YouTube and blogs, but not in scholarship. So my encouragement, however mean this sounds, my encouragement is do not waste your time. You can watch everything you want. If you want to dialogue with me, or absolutely. It's just if your faith isn't ready for that, and that makes you upset to hear people disagree with that, then you're not ready for that. But whatever it is, I'm telling you, if I line up 100 historians, 100 would not agree with that. They all think Jesus existed. It's a basic fact. Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to say about that, because it's in a lifetime. Here's a quick 3 things I want to emphasize. Quick 3 things. Okay, Gospels are an ancient genre in the ancient world. Okay, they are a form of history writing. Genre matters. It's not a cookbook. It's not anything else. It is a form of history writing. That is to say, they think they're writing something about what actually occurred in the space-time continuum. Please do not think history means they cared about every single detail like they're writing a newspaper. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt there. But they do think it's a history. They're not writing a fiction. Bios or lives were not fictions. They were a kind of history. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write them differently. Yep. But lives or biographies, ancient biographies, preferred using other literary sources. The Gospels do that all the time. They use the Old Testament all the time. And maybe another document. And two, biographies, prefer to use eyewitness sources. Polybius, who's a Roman historian, also says you prefer the living testimony. So did Papias, who was an early Christian as well. If they have a living eyewitness, they prefer that person first, literary sources second, when you're writing a biography, an ancient biography. And that's what, again, almost every New Testament scholar thinks that Gospels are a kind of ancient biography. Does that mean every single word they said happened just as it said? No, I'm not talking about that just yet. It means, number one, they think they're writing not a fiction, a fairy tale, a comic book. They're not writing a novel or a chronicle. They think they're writing a life, a biography, which is a kind of history. They wanted to get it basically right. Some people say, well, David, why is it just an ancient novel? Novels almost always had one chief mode of expression, one chief theme in novels, and that is love. Novels were almost all romance novels. We say the word romance novel as an expression. And this time period, just to say the word novel typically meant romance novel. It almost always involved love, including the Jews. Jews could write novels. And when they did, almost always, it's a love story. Almost always. They had a thing called a historical novel, but they're very rare, and Jews didn't write them. They don't seem to have written them. We don't have evidence of that. A chronicle is different as well. Chronicles prefer to talk about things usually in the more ancient past. And so when you look at different genres of the ancient world, and the specialists, we study people who know more even I do, of course, study all the genres that ancient people had at their disposal. And the Gospels don't fit nicely in any other category but ancient bios, or life, or biography. And under that kind of category, there's different subcategories, and they debate about which gospel fits which life better. And that's fine, but that's not what we're doing here. I'm making big picture, 40,000-foot observations. It is a form of history writing. People ask me that online, atheists, whatever. Well, I mean, comic books get it right sometimes too. Captain America was written around World War II. There are facts in that, right? You'd have to demonstrate that ancient people wrote in comic book theories or wrote in historical novels. You have to find that Jews write that, and Jews didn't do it. They didn't. When they wrote with so many historical details, they were not writing a novel or a fiction. They weren't doing it. They just weren't. When they tried to get their eyewitness literary sources, they thought they're writing a kind of history. That's first and foremost. Secondly, because it is a biography, also historical novels didn't contain people in the recent past. And when you have the Gospels have an overwhelming amount of historical anchors, it just doesn't make sense. Another analogy I was going to give is the Lord of the Rings. People have said that too. They'll go, do you also believe in the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit or Harry Potter? Outside of being, they're just a way of being very condemnatory and trying to make fun of Christianity. The argument against that is no, because the Lord of the Rings is not based in history, and no one thinks that. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it. Now, if I didn't know who J.R.R. Tolkien was, and we didn't have interviews of him, which we do, and you know YouTube and see old black and white videos of him, that's not at all, if we didn't have them at all and just read it, and we found no place called Middle Earth, and no cities, and no towns, and none of the characters corroborated, we know right away this is not a kind of history. And then it reads like a fiction and so forth. The ancient biography focused on a main character and a recent memory of the living witnesses. Most of them did. You have some biographies of ancient figures, and then you have eyewitness testimony, of course. Now, biographies could easily rearrange the material, expand the material, minimize the material, all the time, because the goal of a biography is to emphasize the virtues of the protagonist, the main character. That's the goal. In John's Gospel, Jesus overturns the money changer's temple first thing in his ministry. He changed water to wine, but basically goes to Jerusalem, overturns the money changer's temple, gets him in trouble, and then he has his whole ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the last thing he does before he gets crucified. So some Christians say, well, then he did it twice then. Well, maybe. Most scholars don't think that at all. Most think John put it at the very beginning to set the tone. Because in John's gospel, he portrays Jesus as the living embodiment of the temple. And that's why in John, is it 1:14 or so, in the prologue, he says that the Word became flesh, and the Greek is, and he tabernacled among us. He became a new temple. So John's theology is that Jesus is a walking temple, a walking tabernacle, the walking Word made flesh. So therefore the temple is irrelevant immediately. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's not presented as the temple in the flesh. So they have no problem expanding, minimizing, rearranging the materials. They just don't have a problem with that. We have a problem with that if you think a gospel has to be word for word, exactly right, stenographic, newspaper article, then you're always going to have a problem with the Gospels. They did not. Ancient people did not have a problem. Let me say it this way. When an ancient person read an ancient biography, they were not looking for those kinds of details. That was not their questions to be asking. What exactly did he look like? That was not what they would have asked. It's like saying, when I read an ancient biography, I go, how do I bake a cake? Yep, you're asking the wrong question. It's not the point of an ancient biography. That's like with ancient details. What they would have asked is, who's the main character? What's usually a he? What's his character like? And I want to hear stories that bring out that. So the disciples go, who is this guy? And most Christians today go, boy, those poor old dumb disciples, they don't get a thing. In the ancient world, that's probably not what they would have said. What they would have said is, wow, Jesus really is hard to understand. You see the difference? And so in most modern cultures, and certainly in most modern sermons, not with me, hopefully ever, the point is not about the peripheral characters. The point is always about Jesus. Because that's what gospel biographies are. They're always about the main character. So it's not about the leadership of Peter. It's not about how to fail or whatever. It's about how Jesus, and it can be about. Now, it doesn't mean you can never talk about a peripheral character, but biographies don't have a problem. There are several signs that the Gospels come from eyewitness testimony. There are several signs, and I'm going to talk about some of those here tonight. Some of them, but there's some. Now, it's important to note that the sayings of Jesus seem to be typically reproduced more carefully than the narrative sections. If you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels that are very, very similar, they hardly disagree on what Jesus says. But on narrative material, things he did, there's a much more freedom. Not willy-nilly, but there's a lot more freedom. Probably or presumably because the sayings material comes from Jesus. For example, when Jesus speaks, there are numerous Aramaisms. Aramaism, that because Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic. Aramaic. And when you put an Aramaic expression and it comes through the Greek, when the Greek speakers try to use an Aramaic idiom or expression, we call that an Aramaism. That is, it's in Greek, but it's funny Greek. It's funny Greek. Well, when Jesus speaks, there's numerous Aramaisms. Now, it could be the gospel writers are just really clever chaps, and they're willing to look like it was genuine. That's possible. Most historians don't think that. Most historians think the reason why the sayings of Jesus have numerous Aramaisms, funny Greek-sounding Aramaic expressions, because it's actually authentic, because Jesus spoke Aramaic. That it says telltale sign that it actually reproduced, or they're trying to reproduce something he actually said. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah.
They're trying. So if they did it to be clever, that is very clever. It's very clever if they made that up. Otherwise, they didn't make it up. And when they wrote it in Greek, they're translating these things, but Jesus spoke in Aramaic, so did Peter and others. And so they're trying to get these Aramaisms just right. Now, Kenneth Bailey, he's a guy. Kenneth Bailey is a professor who taught in Israel. He was in Israel for about 40 years or so. And so he knows Middle Eastern culture very, very, very well. And he wrote an article, then some other articles and books and so forth that have really been very influential in New Testament studies when it comes to this particular issue. And he said, look, I know the Middle East. I know how they talk. I know how they communicate. I know how they carry on oral tradition. And there's different ways of carrying on this communication, this oral tradition. And when you analyze it closely, there are different ways to get at it. And there's one thing that he calls informal, controlled oral tradition. I don't have time to unpack all that, but it's a way of saying it's informal because it's not from formally trained professors passing it down, but it is controlled because the group controls it, because it's oral, and so the group knows when you're going to mess up. They go, They do that all the time. Someone will retell a story. It's story time. They don't have a TV, right? They tell the story time. And they'll say, and a long time ago in the ancient times, it's, no, it's not ancient times. It's old times. They will correct them live. If there's a new story to tell, the storyteller will say it, and they'll say a bit and then stop and repeat it. And they'll go and say and repeat it over and over and over in the group setting. And so he unpacks these different forms. He thinks the Gospels are a form of informal, controlled oral tradition. Now that's debated, but it's becoming much, much more accepted amongst New Testament specialists that it is a good analogy of what happened in the Gospels themselves. Which is not the same as a stenographic courtroom, absolute certain accuracy, but rather an informal, controlled tradition that you can't go crazy willy-nilly. There's freedom. You can minimize a little bit. You can expand a little bit. Absolutely. You can rearrange the material. Absolutely. They would not think you're being dishonest. They don't think you're being a bad historian. They say you're being a good historian because you're giving you have the freedom, but you don't have willy-nilly freedom. Why don't you have willy-nilly freedom? Because you're writing a bios, a life, a biography. You can't just make junk out of thin air. You can't. There's a control to it. And for some people who have a real hard time for absolute certainty, I love this quote by Jimmy Dunn. James Dunn he's one of the world's leading New Testament scholars on the planet. I appreciate how he says this. Whoever looks for chronological accounts, detailed conciseness in every episode recorded, pedantic precision in reproducing Jesus' teaching as given, word for word, and such like, will be disappointed. But not because of anything scholars have said or done, rather because the evangelists, the gospel writers, themselves were not concerned with such matters. The fault here, if fault there be, lies not in the scholars or in their findings, but in the false expectations with which so many have come to the Gospels. I appreciate how Ben Witherington III, who's a very, very well-respected evangelical scholar here in America, Jimmy Dunn is in Scotland, I believe. Ben Witherington says it this way. The historical critical method, with all its limitations and capabilities, is used by the vast majority of New Testament scholars, including evangelicals. That's exactly right. That's our number one method we're trained in. What did it mean back then? It must be stressed that this method is incapable of producing absolutely certain results. The most one can reasonably expect is that it may demonstrate that there is a good probability that something did or did not happen. When the method is unable to accomplish even this, it does not necessarily mean that the events under scrutiny are of doubtful historicity. The evidence may be too scant or complex to come to a proper conclusion. Sometimes we just say, I give the best educated guess. So my encouragement at this point, before I move on pretty quickly, is we don't always know exactly certain what he said, but we have reason to trust that it is very, very close to what he said. Granting that, the gospel authors did feel freedom to expand, minimize, and rearrange the material as they saw fit. Since I've covered a mouthful there, and just for speed, do you have any questions for me so far in that? Any questions at all about ancient biography?
Pastor David, I'm having troubles reading the title of the article or the book.
This has been one thing. It's called Principles for Interpreting the Gospels and Acts.
Thank you.
Principles for Interpreting the Gospels and Acts, pages 51 to 52. It's an essay he did, an article. Principles for Interpreting the Gospels and Acts. Yeah. You're welcome. Any questions? You might find it annoying, and I appreciate that, I understand, but why I use it, and it's just scholars, you just very seldom, when you're talking to someone really seriously in scholarship, you don't say, then Jesus said. If you really ask them, sometimes when no one's listening, they'll say, Jesus probably said. They always throw in the word probably, because in history, you're just not certain. You say, he probably said that. He probably said that. But nevertheless, that's how we roll. because of that same reason. Okay, so the first thing is, why trust that Christianity is true? Because almost certainly is an ancient form of biography, which means it's not fairy tale, fiction, or whatever. 2, Gospels record characters who are corroborated outside the New Testament. There are characters in the New Testament that we know existed from other ancient literary sources. Let that sink in for a second, because some major characters in the ancient world, like Josephus, who is one of the most invaluable sources for first century Judaism we possessed, is never mentioned in any other source. And no one in scholarship doubts Josephus existed. Yet he's never corroborated. Well, David, if he was such an important historian, why didn't anybody mention him? That's what everyone says about Jesus. Well, he is mentioned many times, and I'll give you some quotes. But there are many, think about this for a second. Before Facebook, can you even imagine? Before the internet, before email, before the newspaper, how many millions of people have literally been lost in the history of the world? Epitaphs have been lost from the tombstones. We will never know they existed, ever. And you'll hear that some of the atheists. Well, Peter is such a big deal. Why isn't Peter mentioned in all the ancient? Why did Herodotus or what? Come on now. Come on now. There are more, and I'll say this later, there are more quotes that Jesus existed, more mentions of him than Caesar Augustus. I mean, but not every character is mentioned. But when you look at the New Testament, there are a lot of people who are corroborated. These are just some. These are really just a little bit. Like Roman emperors, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius. So in the red, these are people mentioned in the New Testament that we know they existed from other sources. Roman governors or prefects, Pontius Pilate, Sergius Paulus, Gallio, Felix and Festus, local rulers, all the Herods, high priests, prominent women, prominent men, John the Baptizer, James the Just. These are some examples of characters who are corroborated. Unlike Lord of the Rings, unlike the Book of Mormon of their ancient tribes, unlike all kinds of things. Does that make sense? So does that mean everything is true in the Gospels? No. Okay. But first we're trying to demonstrate this isn't crazy. They're not willy-nilly. Kind of move ahead. So these are all corroborated. We know they exist from other sources. Josephus, the guy I just mentioned, listen to what he says. Now he's talking about Jesus. He lived around this. He wrote this around 93 to 94 A.D. Festus was now dead, and the new Roman procurator of Judea was Albinus, from about 62 to 64. Was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So Josephus mentions James, who's the brother of the one called the Christ. This is a Jew writing this. So if Jesus didn't exist, you're hard-pressed to figure out why Josephus mentions his brother. Now this next quote is very debated because they think Christians made up the red parts. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Most, again, scholars think Christians inserted that in the copies that we have. We don't know, but it might be the case. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. Now, it's very unlikely that Josephus, the non-Christian, would claim that Jesus was the Messiah. And that's why they think Christians probably added that in there. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. A lot of scholars think that's not what he really said. And the tribe of the Christians, so-called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Most New Testament Roman historians of the time period, any kind of historian of the time period, think Josephus did say this. They debate about these red phrases, if that makes sense. Some think the whole thing was made up, but most don't think that. Some think that. So here's Josephus talking about Jesus and his followers within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Then there are references, possible references to Jesus in what's called the Talmud. If you're not familiar, yeah?
In the top quote, was the red debated as well?
Some debate it, most don't.
Okay.
Yeah, and I almost did a different color to make sure I didn't confuse you on that, sorry. Yeah, the top quote, most people think that's exactly what he said. Another reason why they think that's what he said, and maybe the bottom quote too, is because they found oh man, I wish I by memory here. I think it's a Coptic translation. There's a translation of Josephus that is very ancient, that has those. So it becomes very unlikely that Christians inserted it at such a primarily early stage of his writing it, that it made it to the copies, if that makes sense. So they think, well, then probably was the original. Certainly the top one.
Okay.
But some think even some of the bottom. But the bottom is hotly attested. If you're a person who doesn't believe Jesus existed, the bottom one particularly, they're like, no, there's no way he would have ever said any of that stuff. And I find that pretty quite. Actually, my view, the bottom quote, I think he probably didn't say the red one. Except they might have it like he appeared to them spending a third day restored, maybe. But I don't think he said. I don't think Josephus said he was the Messiah. I don't think he would have said that, and I don't think he would have said if one ought to come a man. That's my opinion. I think the first one he absolutely said. There's nothing about that is confessional. Good question. Jews in the time of Jesus, that's a long story, but they had a lot of oral tradition, and then they wrote a document around 8200 called the Mishnah. Later on, they had a commentary on the Mishnah called the Talmud. They had two forms of the Talmud, the Palestinian or Jerusalemite and the Babylonian, which came later. In the Babylonian Talmud, there are sayings that seem to, almost all of them, if not all of them, seem to talk about Jesus. This is from the Talmud. These are full-blown Jews who are not Christians. They called Jesus, it was a sorcerer with his disciples. They called him a wonder worker. They said that he references times where he was healing in the name of Jesus. Some references, or a Torah teacher, a son or a disciple that turned out badly. He practiced magic, turned to idolatry. That was a common one. He had punishment in the afterlife, that he was executed, that he was the son of Mary. These are just some of the quotes. I mean, I could go on and on because of time. I'm not. I don't. But if you didn't know this, now again, there are scholars who say no, none of these things are about Jesus himself. But I don't find that convincing. But if you want, I need to work on my PhD a little bit on some of this. So there are characters. Number 3, there are locations that are corroborated outside the New Testament. Let this sink in for a second. Josephus, who's the Jewish historian I just told you about. The quote that David asked me about?
Is Jesus mentioned by people other than Josephus?
Yes.
In the Talmud? Are there others that mention Jesus?
In the Talmud or any other source?
Other sources.
There are other sources.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Within about 200 years, which is a long time, there's about 41 mentions of his name.
Okay.
Now, that's including the Gospels and so forth. But you have people like Tacitus and Tacitus, and I think maybe Suetonius. They get his name. They call him Christus, who's a Latinized corruption of almost certainly Christ. You have people like that. And I was going to put a quote of all the references in my Bible, which is one version of my Bible, and I think it's in my office. I have a list of all the ancient references. If you want, I kept it there for fun to go back and read, but there are a bunch of them. You can probably also do a Google search for like every outside New Testament reference to Jesus. And what's interesting, by the way, is if you take those sources written within, say, 100 years of the life of Jesus, not the Gospels, outside sources, and many, many, many scholars have done this for the last, 100 years. But if you look all those stories together and put the facts together, like a bullet point, it is the Gospel. It's born in Nazareth. He taught disciples in Israel, Galilee. He went around preaching about the kingdom of God. He was a wonder worker. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers said he raised him the third day. I mean, this is an outline of what we call the gospel story. Not in the Gospels, just from Romans and Jews. In my view, that alone is enough to substantiate Christianity. If everything else, he didn't really say the Sermon on the Mount, he really didn't do this, he really didn't, Bartimaeus was fictional. Okay, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that's all made up. Non-Christian sources tell us enough of the outline of Jesus that if it is true, he's the Messiah. That's my opinion. So I get excited because it's pretty cool. You don't have that in other people, ancient story. They didn't talk like that. So the characters are corroborated locations. Josephus, that Jewish historian, lived in Palestine. That's his place. He lived there, and he describes it. He has a lot of writings. When he talks about locations he mentions, 80% of what he mentions have been corroborated. The Gospels, 81%. Boom! So the Gospels are the same, a little bit better in archaeological and literary corroboration than even Josephus, who lived there for years and years. Does that make sense to you? So if you dismiss the Gospels as all make-believe, well, that's silly because Josephus isn't make-believe. Everyone thinks that he didn't get it all right, but it's amazing that these works line up so closely. After the Gospels that we know are written, Christians and other forms of Christians kept writing books called Gospels. We call them the Apocryphal Gospels. They talk about locations. Look how badly they get it. And like Simon Gathercall put these together. In the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Mary, there are no locations mentioned at all. None. Our Gospels have tons of them. The Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas says the world and Judea. That's the only locations mentioned. The world and Judea. Gospel of Philip has the world and Jerusalem. The Sophia of Jesus Christ places Mount Olivet in Galilee, which it's not, if you didn't know that. Infancy Gospel of Thomas has the region of Bethlehem, which is not, it's a town, and the town of Nazareth, which is not, that's a region. A little footnote. In the Quran, there are two major documents, almost certainly, that they used for Muhammad's information about Jesus. And one of them is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The other is called the Gospel of Judas. And we know that because we have those sources. So when Muhammad heard about Jesus, he heard about Jesus from false apocryphal Gospels, never from the Gospels themselves, because the stories he tells, they're from these documents that no one thinks are accurate. Gospel of Barnabas, Jesus sailed to his city of Nazareth. Sailed! Nazareth is landlocked. You don't sail to Nazareth. Gospel of Philip has extensive discussion of the temple, which is completely wrong. These are other so-called Gospels, and they're miserable at giving us historically accurate locations. Does that make sense? When you compare it to our Gospels, they line up amazingly to what actually occurred, unlike the Book of Mormon, unlike the Lord of the Rings, or whatever it is. It lines up over and over and over. In fact, as archaeologists keep discovering things, it keeps being corroborated. Not to mention all the archaeological stuff. Here's a small snippet of evidence. Small things we've uncovered in the archaeological. And I'll go with David if I can to stop it. We have a first century synagogue inscription at Caesarea that proves Nazareth was a town at the time of Jesus. And now actually they've been digging in Nazareth, but it proves it. We have inscriptions from Augustus that proves 3 different censuses were taken at Jesus' birth. We have numerous excavations proving that Herod the Great was ruling when Jesus was born, along with excavations proving Herod Antipas ruled in Galilee, which the Gospels say. We've uncovered portions of the synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus taught. I've been there. We've uncovered the remains of Peter's actual house in Israel. I've been there too. We have the bone box, the ossuary of James, Jesus' brother, and the ossuary of the high priest who helped sentence Jesus to death, Joseph Caiaphas. We have inscriptions that prove Pontius Pilate ruled during Jesus' life. We could go on and on and on of hard facts that corroborated over and over and over again. Does that mean every word in the Gospels can be? No, doesn't mean it's certain. It just means, again, I'm trying to take away trying to own in that this should be taken very seriously. Dave, what was your?
I was wondering the infancy
Yes.
Gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
Is in that is a clay bird
Yes.
given to life?
Good memory, that's right. So
Okay.
in the Quran, it says, I won't try to quote it, but the Quran states that Jesus, I think he said he was given by the Father power. They used it I think Muhammad used it as an example of Jesus's power or authority or something, because he turned a clay dove into a real dove, and there's some kids involved. That's from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
And it's only showed up there. All the ancient evidence comes from there. And he has other evidence. He has other stories that come from the Gospel of Judas. Almost certainly. We can't prove he had that. Most likely what happened is, that little footnote, most likely historically, I find very convincing, is that Muhammad had not read those things. I don't think he really could read at all. I think they're telling the truth when he was illiterate. I think the kind of Christianity with which he came in contact was a kind of very, very southern Saudi Arabian, Gnostic kind of Christianity. That's the only kind of connection with Christianity he had. And that's where he'd eavesdrop these stories through the trade routes and so forth. And they have been influenced by these documents, which are written, some of them are written around the year 300 AD, which is a couple of years before he lived. So these are much later documents that were written. That's what I think. I'm not as convinced that some people say he deliberately distorted the truth. Maybe. I have a suspicion that's not what happened. I think the so-called Christians he came across were Gnostic. They valued these documents more than the other Gospels, and that's where he heard his stories. And the Jewish stories he tells, the Old Testament stories, I think the same thing. I think they were oral tradition based on local groups of Jews that he had met. And then there's like little synopsis, little summary stories mixed in with, Muhammad's the prophet. And I find it more convincing that it's from memory that he's heard these stories, like Joseph Smith did when he wrote the Book of Mormon. They're just little summary parts of the Bible. That's my view. Characters are corroborated, locations are corroborated, and this is amazing. Names and the frequency of names fit perfectly. Let me ask you a quick question. If I say write out the top 10 baby names of 2018, could you do it in America? Not searching Google. What about 2008, just 10 years ago?
No.
Okay. What about 50 years ago? Let's say 1960-something, 1970s. Top 10 baby names. Now do it for Asia.
Do it for what?
Asia.
No.
Japanese. The odds are all of us will be. Think about this. Let that sink in for a second. How well do you really think you do? I probably get a couple because I have children, so they're 13 years old, 12, right? So I'll probably get some because I think it was pretty popular to have a lot of Aidens or Cadens, which I didn't know at the time. I named Hayden. Oh, Lord, after that, Hayden, Caden, Aiden, Jaden, Braden.
Yes.
I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know anybody named Hayden. But those kind of things, now Bella is real popular. I could get maybe one or two. But on the list, where would I get it? There's no way I would guess. I'd probably get in the top 10, top 20 maybe. But now imagine it's 100 years ago. Gertrude and whatever, and now a different land. Just think about it. There's no way you would do well with that. Well, we can, there's a book, I think it's in 2 volumes. They've gone through and written down all the names and all the inscriptions on tombstones, all in Palestine, for about 300 or 400 years. But the author focused really on about the time period of Jesus. And we have all of the names used in Palestine, that exact region of all the world, at the exact era of all the world in which the Gospels are written. And then they've compared the top 10, like baby names, the top 10 names, top 20, top 50 names of Jewish males, top 50 names of Jewish females. So that we know exactly, we can rate it. When you look at the same kind of data for Egypt, they have radically different names. Egyptian names are clearly different from those in Palestine and Judaism in the 1st century. Those that are Greek, those are Roman. The names are very different. Like if I said Japanese versus Mexican versus whatever. They're very different names. Well, when you compare it to the Gospels, look what happens. The top 2 men's names in the 1st century are Simon and Joseph. It's 15.6% of all names. In the Gospels and Acts, it's 18.2%. The top 9 men's names in 1st century Israel outside are 41.5%. In the Gospels, it's 40.3%. The top 2 women's names in Mary are Miriam and Salome. 28.6% of all female names in the Gospels, 38.9%. The top 9 women's names in the 1st century, 49.7%. And the Gospel in Acts, 61.1%. It means it is overwhelmingly accurate and exactly what you would expect to find by Jewish names of males and females of this exact region at this exact time. And again, when you compare it to the Apocryphal Acts and other things, the Egyptian names, they are crazy wrong. But the Gospels are not crazy wrong, they're crazy right. I mean, these are within staggering proportions. Staggering. There's a reason why in the Gospels, we didn't know this, and I've said it here and there in sermons or whatever, like Mary Magdalene. These disambiguations, these John the Baptizer, the baptizing one, Magdalene of Magdala, it adds disambiguations, these little from so-and-so, because there are so many stinking Marys in the first century in Palestine of Jewish women. And the Gospels absolutely reflect that's exactly right. They always have to disambiguate or clarify. Which one are you talking about? One scholar I was reading did such a great job. Peter Williams is the same guy. I mean, it's just amazing. He went back and looked, and it's just so staggering when you look at it. I never noticed in my entire life. I love those moments when he really helps you see it. In the gospel stories, it's amazing. In the narrative, whenever someone's speaking to Jesus, they always disambiguate. Jesus, son of David. Jesus of Nazareth. Is this not Jesus, the son of Mary or Joseph the carpenter's son? Is this not, they disambiguate. But when the gospel writer is talking about Jesus, he never disambiguates. Now, why is that? Because within the actual historical world where that happened, they did that because there's other Yeshuas in the crowd. Jesus was like the 6th most common name, Yeshua. Or maybe 10th. I think it was in the top 10. But when the gospel writer's talking about Jesus, we know who he's talking about. Because it's not Yeshua, right? Jeshua or Joshua, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying to you? When it says Mary, it doesn't just say Mary, 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 Mary. It says Mary Magdalene, Mary, so forth. Mary, there's always a disambiguation. Because in the ancient world, Mary was the top most common Jewish female name in the ancient world. What's staggering that the gospel writers are so consistent with that every single time they're recording a dialogue about something, it always disambiguates. It's like you're eavesdropping on an ancient conversation.
All these characters, I'm doing Genesis now, and all these characters, so-and-so, 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 so-and-so.
So-and-so.
And the next line, they do it all over again. So
do it all over again.
Every time you use that name, they have to reference him. So-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so.
Yeah, of all the ones we're talking about, the one son of so-and-so.
It's so redundant, but they had to be sure they knew who they were talking about.
Does this mean that therefore every word is exactly how it was said? No. But it means we should take it very seriously. It means wherever they got their data, there's no way they just made up the names and got this stinking accurate. I mean, let's be real. No. There's no way they made that up and got that accurate. There's just no way. It's impossible.
Writers don't fake stuff like that.
You don't fake stuff. How in the world would you fake stuff and nail it? And when people, non-Christians, well, that was written hundreds of years after the fact. No. And if it was written hundreds of years of the fact after, if it were, but it's not, that's even more staggering. Yeah. That the oral tradition was memorized that well for so long to get this right.
Were the tombstones faked that many centuries after the fact?
Right, were the tombstones faked? That's right. Yeah. Right. Go ahead.
In like the 1800s, people didn't have baby name books. They looked in the Bible and picked a name.
Very good. They didn't have baby names books. They didn't have, that's exactly, they picked the Bible, that's right. Or their family names were very popular, the family names. That's right. Peter Williams gives this exact quote. He and Richard Bauckham are New Testament scholars who I use them a lot because, I mean, it's amazing. 5, Gospels are not overly Pauline or Pauline. I want to talk about that in a second. Nor do they present late 1st, early 2nd century issues. Now, this is really, really amazing. For example, and I won't spend too much longer here. For example, when the Apostle Paul writes to his churches, he writes to the churches earlier than when the Gospels were written. He writes in his 50s, early 60s. The Gospels, I think Mark was written no later than mid-60s. That's my opinion. And I think Matthew was right after him. And Luke, I think all the Gospels were written no later than the early 70s, no later. But nevertheless, Paul's writings, the letters of 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all these places, they were written early. In Paul's world to the churches, there are very particular problems that show up over and over and over again, like the emphasis to a Gentile mission. Should Gentiles be brought in the church? Are they going to get circumcised first or not? What's the role of it? Is the pressing issue of the early church. Acts 15 is all about that. It is the pressing issue of the early church. None of that is in the Gospels. There's no hint of it. Well, that's weird. It makes me think that the Gospels are not written to make sure it sounds like other churchy made-up problems. You would expect that the Gospels were made up by the churches to make it fit their own theological agenda. You would read a whole lot about Jesus going, here's what we really should do with the Gentile mission. Wink, wink. And so Paul goes, see, I told you, that's my favorite gospel. That's not what you find. They're different issues. And Paul's world, circumcision is a really big deal. It's barely talked about in the Gospels. Paul's world, those terms for justification, sanctification, and propitiation, all these words, that barely is ever talked about in the Gospels. The expression, term, Son of God, is Paul's one of his favorite ways to talk about Jesus Christ. It's barely mentioned in the Gospels. Paul's emphasis upon end times, and we're almost there, and then he says in Romans 12, the day is here, the night is far coming to an end, the day is at hand, therefore, he's constantly end times, the Gospels barely talked about it at all. By the time you get to the early 2nd century, there's a huge emphasis on the role of bishops. When we get to Ignatius, he's right on the turn of the century, there's a big emphasis on the role of that. Why? Because to keep sound doctrine. There's a lot more versions of Christianity popping up, and you've got to have a person who's been trained by people before you. None of that's in the Gospels. There were heresies attacked by Ignatius and Papias and others, the 2nd, 3rd century. None of that is brought up in the Gospels. So, if the Gospels, were fictional, and this is a very common charge, they were just written for the later churches and their own theological agendas, we would expect to see a bunch of problems raised that Paul experienced or the early church experienced in 2nd century. None of that is there. When you read the Gospels, it's about Jesus walking around Galilee, talking to fishermen. It just fits very well. And that goes to my next point. Does that make sense what I'm saying so far? Are you rolling with me on that?
Yeah.
So they're not Pauline, they're not later, and they fit the Jewish theological landscape very, very well, the 1st century. It fits it just right of what we know from it. For example, when you look at Jewish sources outside of the Gospels, like Josephus and even the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran community, and then later on the Mishnah, on the Talmud, when you look at all the stuff they say about in Philo, when you look at all their stuff, and in the Gospels too, they fit perfectly on the main things they care about. They fit perfectly. We know for a fact every Jew in the time period of that 1st century cared a whole lot about the temple and a whole lot about the synagogue. They talked about it all the time. Remember, the temple's destroyed in AD 70. After that, some people still talk about it, some don't. But before the temple fell, there's a lot of talk about it, a lot of temple synagogue. That's exactly what we find in the Gospels. The 2 major theological locations in the Gospels are the temple and the synagogue. There are common doctrines, monotheism, that there's one God, common emphasis upon purity, ritual and moral purity. That's exactly what we find in the Gospels. Other Jewish sources talk about how Jews disagreed on certain doctrines, like how God's reign was established. The Gospels are the same way. They disagreed on Roman rule. Should we pay our taxes or not? Should we... Give me a shekel. Whose image is on there? Or denarius. It's exactly what we find in the Gospels. They contested what the role the Messiah would play. It's exactly what we find in the Gospels. They disagreed on life after death. Sadducees didn't believe in life after death. Well, let me ask you this, Jesus. Let me say this. Okay, a guy gets married to a woman, then he dies and marries a brother 7 times, and on and on. That's exactly what we find. They disagree on the role of angels. That's exactly what we find in the Gospels. Common practices. Circumcision. Absolutely. We know in the Gospels that Jews Here are some. It's not as talked about as much the Apostle Paul. Shabbat, Sabbath rule, go to Mark chapter 4. Your disciples don't. They keep working on the Sabbath. Food laws, ritual bathing, or washing your hands. Contested practices, the definition of work, fasting on the Sabbath, hand washing. So these kinds of issues, we know Jews agreed upon and disagreed upon. That's exactly what we find in the Gospels. People are testing Jesus on exactly what you and I would expect them to be testing him on, because it was a contested issue in that first century context.
What did you say that these things were based on, like historically?
Good question. Other authors like Josephus is our most important source. A good question, yeah. Josephus is our most important source. Josephus. Philo mentions some references to these things. Josephus is the biggie. And then you have other sources. He's a Jewish author. I won't get bogged down, but and then you have other later rabbinic sources. So you have this rabbinic source called the Mishnah. And in the Talmud, though it's a couple centuries later, it almost certainly records some actual practices of the first and second centuries, the first century particularly. And we know that because of the rabbis it mentions, and we can date the rabbis to the grave sites and other sources. So it's still used as a source for what happened in the first century. The whole thing is not, but certain sections are. So when you compare these with the Gospels, and by the way, historians do, because the Gospels are not treated as sacred texts. They're treated like an ancient text. We take them seriously. And when you find out the Gospels fit like a really nice puzzle piece that fits perfectly in the world of Judaism, not Egyptian life, not Roman life or Greek life, early church life, not Asian, but first century Palestinian life. That's amazing. So the locations are corroborated, the names are corroborated, archaeological data keeps corroborating it, the theological landscape fits corroborated. Does that make sense so far? Not anything make it certain, but I'm going to perk up very seriously about all these things and go, wait a second, we're really talking about a document that should not be dismissed. This is not some ancient fairy tale. It is overwhelmingly pointing to an historical document. And then the issue is, what does it tell us in it? Now, instead of talking about the life of Jesus, which is very important, I'm going to go to the main thing, and that is the resurrection. And I would say, and the ascension. Those are different things. Now, there are people... let me pause just for a second, because we're doing really good on time. Let me pause for... Do you have any questions about anything I've covered so far? I hope this isn't too fast. I hope y'all are intelligent, but I know this is a lot of data. And if you want some master notes, like on all these little bullet points, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Those that
Yeah.
pop up, I would love that.
Just if you send me an email if you don't mind, remind me. I'd be happy to send it to you. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Any questions at all we'll cover? Anything you need me to repeat? Or unpack more? Maybe I misspoke. Okay? There are those who claim that speaking of resurrection, it simply leaves the realm of history. So if I said, so it's very common in Christianity for Christians to say the resurrection is the best historical explanation. They're going to say that's what you just said is stupid. That's what they say this often. Bart Ehrman will say it like that, but he'll say you can't say that. You cannot say the resurrection is historical. You cannot say that. This is false. Here's exactly what's going on. Historians, like scientists, look for causes to certain events. Let's be real simple here and clear, because that is exactly what historians do. That's all we do. We get trained in the history, particularly the PhD level. You are trained to you're looking for probable causes to an event. You say, this event X might have occurred, Now, if you remember last week, I think it was last week, when I said scholars typically think something really happened if it's in literature and archaeology. I give a list of those things, and so let's say event happened. We'll say, well, it probably happened. We'll look at all the ancient world. Oh, look, we've got literary evidence. We've got an inscription. Okay, now we'll list that it happened. Something happened. That event happened. The Romans conquered blank. Great. So let's say event X happened in history. Oh, it happened what year? Okay. Oh, it looks like they killed a guy named Jesus by Pontius Pilate, probably around April 4th, not around, probably April 3rd, AD 30. That's almost a certain historical fact. I think it is, but we'll call that a probable historical fact. Very, very, very probable. Now the issue is, what's the cause? So if we know that happened, why did it happen? Well, people give a lot of explanations for why that happened. For a long time, a lot of books have been written, a lot of ink's been spilled upon. Why is it? It says cause and event. Cause and or effect, whatever you want to say. What caused it? Like a scientist, if I drop this marker and it falls to the ground, the event, the effect is it fell, and I would say, what caused it? That's all historians do. Historians are looking for causes. If you rule out any cause whatsoever, then it's because your worldview is closed to that. If I said this marker fell down, that's the event, that's the effect, what caused it, and then you said, Susan says, a leprechaun did it. And I say, nope, leprechaun didn't do it. And you say, why not? And I'll say, because I don't believe in leprechauns. See, all of a sudden, my worldview, I disallow that immediately. Whatever you think it was, Susan, you can't say leprechaun. You say, why not? Because we know they don't exist. In my worldview, leprechauns are mythic. And you go, I don't think so at all. I think they do exist. So in your worldview, that's one possible option. In my worldview, no, it ain't. That's how it is with history. Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian, now he's not, is an atheist, and he is a materialist. He thinks all that exists basically is matter and energy. Like most atheists are materialists or naturalists, which means, since resurrection by definition is a supernatural act, you can't say that's history. Because history is only what happens inside of the space-time continuum, which is made of matter and energy. Does that make sense to you? Because this is the root of the issue. If you ever meet a real staunch atheist who goes, you can't say this historical. You say, well, why not? You can't say that. When you say that, you've left history. That's false. It means we've left your worldview. Those are very different things. We've left your worldview. I don't do that. I'm open to any cause, no matter what it is, or if it contradicts my own worldview. Susan says, I think it is a leprechaun. I don't go, nope, leprechauns don't exist. They're not my worldview. I don't ever do that. I go, okay, can you give me some evidence the leprechauns did it? I might even say I don't believe in leprechauns. I don't believe leprechauns exist. I might be wrong. I don't go, nope. I go, tell me more. So I'm not dismissing it, but I also don't believe you immediately. I just need evidence. I say, let's put that on the board of all the possible reasons why this fell. And someone else says, I think a star did it. Okay, let's put it on the board. I think a unicorn did it. Let's put it on the board. These are all potential causes. But that's not what materialists do, which most atheists are. Because of that, they will not say resurrection is historical ever, 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 ever. My view is, to use my leprechaun analogy, my view is, I look for causes that best explain the data, no matter if I already believe in that cause or not. If it best explains the data, has the best evidence for it, you've got me, you convinced me. Period. It best explains the data. I might find it hard to believe. I might not like that it exists. I might not like the cause, but if I go, that best explains the data, therefore it has to be that, or some version of that. I think the resurrection best explains the data of what I'm about to tell you. I think the resurrection and the ascension best explains why, and these are a bunch of little things here. Primitive Jews, I don't mean they're dumb, I mean the first few years of the time of Jesus. Ancient Jews, you might say. Primitive Jews said, one man, what I meant was, okay, these are Jewish Christians is what I mean. The primitive in scholarship, when we use the word primitive, we usually mean within the lifetime of Jesus. So let's say 30s. I mean, it's late 20s, I guess you might say, but just for ease sake, we'll say around the year 30, I don't know, about the year 50-ish or so. From around the world 50-ish or so to about 70, we usually say that's the early church. Primitive, early, and then we go on to about the close, 50 to about 100, about the end of the century. Then you get to something called late antiquity. So primitive means the first few decades, the very, very, very earliest. So what happens? So here's Peter and all these earliest Jews who became Christians. These Jews said one man before the end times was raised. And I said this in my sermon on Sunday for those who were there. Nobody thought that. We have no evidence. We have no evidence that any Jew ever thought a resurrection would happen to one person. It was going to be a group event. Two, it'd be at the end of time for everybody. The Jews did say, well, the end of time apparently is here because it happened, but it's not the way we thought. But they went around and said that. All of a sudden, why would they say that? These primitive Jews began worshiping Jesus. No Jew had ever in the history of Judaism worshiped Abraham, Moses, for which we have evidence. Nobody did that, no matter how special they were. No one worshiped King David, Josiah, their favorite kings, never. But they began worshiping Jesus. Worshiping, treating Jesus as deity. Primitive Jews began praying and baptizing and preaching and healing in the name of Jesus, as if that name and his identity was a living authority. They had never done that in the history of Judaism with Abraham, with Moses, with King David, but they did with Jesus all of a sudden. Groups of priests, Pharisees, and even Saul Paul radically changed sides. The opponents of Jesus in his ministry switched after his death. After they saw not just his death, after his crucifixion, which was a sign that he'd been beaten and he's a miserable loser. In their mind, he's a failure. It's the number one stumbling block in Paul's ministry for Jews. Like, you have gone crazy, Paul. He's cursed. Read your Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23. 21, 22 to 23. Read it. Cursed is the one who hangs on a tree. And yet they change sides. Primitive Gentile Christians abandoned Greek and Roman religious practices. Nobody did that in the Greco-Roman world. When you had a new religion come into Greek or Roman town, you just adapted it. You adopted it into what you already did. You did not adopt it and then abandon what you were already doing. You still go to your temples. You just got another temple to go to. They were pluralistic and polytheistic. Pluralistic means all the religions are cool. Like today in America. It's all good. You pick and choose what you want. By the way, it is astonishing in ancient history, if you study if you become a historian at all, it is astonishing how similar we are to the ancient pagans. We are absolutely becoming pagan. Absolutely. It is uncanny and creepy and surreal. It is amazing. Anyway, that's another sermon topic. And then polytheistic means there's many gods. So they had no problem with different. But now these primitive Gentile Christians didn't just give allegiance to Jesus. They gave it solely to Jesus. We have zero evidence that any religious movement at all in the Greek-speaking world and the Latin-speaking Roman world that anybody did that. I can give more examples. So these bullet points and more are facts, as far as we can tell, of the early Christian movement. Atheist, devil-worshipping Bible historians agree with this. These are not disputed, basically, in scholarship. I'm telling you, they're not disputed. What is disputed is what caused it. No one Bart Ehrman, Mr. Previous Christian, now atheist, also does not dispute that. He says, yeah, they really believed it. They really believed they saw Jesus. And he thinks either they saw visions or hallucinated. That's the most common alternate cause as an explanation, is they had mass hallucinations. Which, A, doesn't happen. B, it doesn't explain why priests, Pharisees, and Saul Paul changed sides, who never knew Jesus. Paul never knew Jesus. Why did he change sides? Why would he have a hallucination of a vision that doesn't, I don't find that convincing. Bart Ehrman's going to say, and people like him will say, it doesn't matter. And they've said, I've heard, oh my goodness, I've heard and read so much from them, which is good. They're going to say, it doesn't matter, David, if you find it convincing. What matters is it has to be anything besides a resurrection, because that's not historical. You can say aliens did it, for all I care. I don't care, because aliens could exist inside the universe. You can't say resurrection, you've left history. And I'm an historian. Historians can't say the word resurrection because that's supernatural. That's a miracle. We can't say that. That's out of bounds. Back to my leprechaun analogy. To which I say, fine. It's not because you're a historian. You've left your worldview. I believe any call should be listed on the board, as it were. And I'm just telling you, as these facts are undisputed, the question is, what made them do it? I think the resurrection and the ascension, and that's kind of a long story, best explains why this happened. I don't think hallucination stories best explain the data. I don't think feelings of sadness or remorse of not being the best disciple they could be are very compelling for a lot of reasons. The fact that there was an influx of Gentile Christians is not convincing because the earliest Jews were there. The fact, it took a long, long time for them to develop this God idea is completely unconvincing. From the earliest years, the primitive Jews did this. On and on. I've heard every conceivable possible cause. I've heard combinations of the causes, which just makes it exponentially more improbable. But again, let's be real. If you don't care, if you're a historian who's a materialist, it doesn't matter. You can make up anything. And they'll say, I don't care. Maybe it's hallucination. Who gives a rip? Because it can't be resurrection. So you really become immediately at an impasse. You're just at an immediate impasse. Yeah, go ahead, please. Because I'm
So we see primitive Jews worshiping Jesus and praying, baptizing, preaching, healing in Jesus' name in the gospel accounts. What about in other sources, other ancient sources? Does that allude to?
So is it in other ancient sources that Christians worship Jesus? That's a good question. I bet I have something prepared for that.
Great.
See, good. Yes, it is.
Well, look at that.
Pliny the Younger, who's a Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. That's a modern-day Turkey. He writes to his uncle, Trajan. That's pretty cool. Your uncle's the emperor of the whole Roman Empire. He writes a letter about year 112. This is not long after 1 and 2 Peter are written, probably, at least 2 Peter. He writes to his emperor, he's found some Christians. He don't know what to do with them. And he explains the scenario. He says, these Christians, they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud. That is, they didn't promise to do bad things. They weren't a criminal cult. They promised not to do bad things like fraud, theft, or adultery. Never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Now he goes on to say a lot more. In fact, he finds 2 deaconesses and tries to get them to recant, so he tortures them, kills them. And then his other people keep giving the names of Christians. And he writes them and says, should I go and hunt them all down or what? I've not been doing that, and so forth. Trajan writes back and says, you're right, don't hunt them down. But if someone says they were doing, gives you a list, if you've seen whatever, then yeah, you do that. And then he writes them back, and we have all those documents. And so we have, and many, many other. Lucian of Samosata, who's a Greek satirist, he did not like the Christians. He was written around the 2nd century, the early 100s. He says the Christians worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage have introduced their novel rites, that means like rituals, you might say, of baptism, communion, and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver, Jesus, that they are all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. So here's our Gentile Christians who now worship him, and he's making a point to say they abandon. It's unique. Nobody abandoned that gods. And that's why the Gentile Christians were called atheists. The number one title given for Gentile Christians was atheist, because they no longer paid homage to the temple of the pagan gods. There are many quotes like this in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. Many, many quotes like this. I only gave you 2. That thing in my Bible I told you, I think, has all the rest of them. You also do a Google search if you want on early references to Christians in their early documents. And this is one reason, it's one of the main reasons why historians, again, back to this point a second ago, these are just undisputed facts. Everybody's going to say, yeah, the early Christians were known for worshiping that. Claudius was an emperor. Suetonius was a Roman historian. And he's writing about these junk going down in Rome. And he says Claudius the emperor expelled all the Jews from Rome in AD 49 because of the instigation of one Chrestus and some other things. Most historians, not all, most think it's what seems to be a typical Latin corruption of Christ, the instigation of one Christ. That is, the Jews got all kicked out because they were fighting. What most scholars think is those were Jewish Christians and just Jewish Jews who were debating and trying to convert each other, and he kicked them all out. And of them, you know of 2 of them.
Yeah, Aquila and Priscilla.
There you go, Aquila and Priscilla, who are quoted in Romans, or mentioned in Romans and also in Acts. And so
Corinth and Ephesus.
they went to Corinth and Ephesus. Very good.
Yeah.
That's mentioned in Suetonius, the Roman historian, talks about Claudius of one Christ. And you have other references. There's many, many references of this. These telltale little hints and passing comments about the early Christians and how despicable they are.
Yeah.
Because they worship this Jesus as if he's a god. They hated it. They called it superstitio. We use the word superstition, which to them is a bad word. It's a very bad word. They don't. Bad concept. They did not like that. So they did think. Again, there's more quotes. I don't have them. None on the PowerPoint. I don't have them, but there's a lot more quotes of them. So on that last point, and I have one more point out this, but just to repeat it one more time, I think the resurrection and ascension best explain why this happened. Yes, sir.
No, Pastor David, if you go to Europe now and you walk to the locations of some of the cities that are mentioned in the Bible, you can actually touch the ruins of temples to Hermes, Ares, the Greek gods, Apollo, Athena, that were maintained past the time of Christ. But as the decades went by, if an earthquake toppled them or a war or something toppled them, you find more and more were not ever rebuilt, not ever restored. But about the same time, temples, or excuse me, not temples, but meeting places for Christians started to be constructed. And it shows you where Christianity went from being the persecuted minority to now being commonly accepted or even becoming the majority in some of those cities. And it's just obvious that Gentile Christians abandoned all these other gods and said, they don't matter to us, they can't help us, when they met the one true God himself, Jesus. There's hard evidence that you can walk up and touch.
Hard evidence that churches were more, there were more churches being erected than there were temples in late antiquity. Late antiquity. Yeah, and that's probably the case because Christianity became legal. They called it a religio illicita, an illicit religion, versus the religio licita. That is, it became a legal religion. And that didn't happen. Huh?
Yeah, I do.
And that didn't happen to the early 4th century. It became the official religion that you had to choose around 380. Theodosius II, he said, this is now the official. So what from this thing you wanted to stamp out from the 300 years, it is the official religion of the Roman Empire. And between that time period, you have spates of times where there was called pogroms. A pogrom is an official doctrine of the emperor, or whatever, to go persecute Christians. Those happen sometimes, not as much as some people like to make out. And they did happen sometimes. And when they happened, and you had some really, really pagan emperors every once in a while who would appear and just try to stomp them out, get rid of the churches. Some hated it. They didn't like it at all. Diocletian and others, Nero didn't, but later on Diocletian didn't. But then you had emperors that were more sensitive to it. And then around the early 4th century, there was a resurgence in Jewish temples. Temples are actually synagogues, were built a good bit. But then by the time Christianity became a legal religion, all of a sudden, churches started popping up. It took us several hundred years before a church building was erected and say that is a church building. For centuries, they met in people's homes. And so also they started popping up. It became more common and legal and not immediately dangerous to be in. The last thing, this is the last thing, and this is short and sweet for tonight, and that is the overall narrative of the Gospels is quite plausible. You think about this. We're not talking about now this is all depending on your own personal point. I get it. But if this were about a 7-headed dragon who's really a Superman by day and a crime fighter at night, but he's really a dragon inside, it becomes just... Instead, the idea of a Jewish teacher in Palestine speaking about the kingdom of God to fellow Jews who gains opponents and is crucified for being a distant and on, that's not crazy. That seems crazy to me. If you dismiss all miracles as crazy, yeah, that sounds crazy. But then the problem with that is you've got a lot of ancient stories in Greek and Roman and Jewish thinking that their great figures did some kind of special things. And in the Gospels, these miracle stories go back to the most primitive material that is part and parcel of Jesus. They never thought he's just a cool dude. It said he was a wonder worker. When the Jews who did not become Christians, the Talmud, when they talked about Jesus, they even said he's a wonder worker. What they opposed was exactly what we find in the Gospels, which is what? The source of that authority and that power to do the miracles, to exorcise demons. Not that he did it. They said you did work magic, which magic means you work for the devil. So even that seems probable to me. I mean, most historians agree Jesus was a wonder worker. And I just think that fits quite powerful. Okay, that's all for tonight. Any questions about what I think makes it very probable that Christianity is true? Any questions?
Off mic question for when
Okay, sure. Why not? Anything else that's on the mind? Next week, thank you for letting me go pretty fast with this, because next week I told Paul that we're going to wrap up. Next week, I really hope you'll come back. I have the last section, which is virtually certain. And it's a lot shorter, and that's the stories about religious experience. And then we're going to open up to an open Q&A with Paul and the youth. So we're inviting all the youth to also come up and have an open Q&A time where anything goes question, particularly about this stuff. He's been working with the youth as well on reasons to believe in Christianity, a little different from mine, but he's been working on a similar thing. And so, same thing with y'all. So we're going to wrap up our study next week and then go into that Q&A at the same time. Does that make sense? So I'll wrap up, won't take 15, 20 minutes maybe, Q&A hopefully.
And then what's going to be the next?
The next study is 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And we'll start that next Wednesday, April 25th.
Okay.
We'll do probably 3 or 4 weeks on 1 Thessalonians, 3 or 4 weeks on 2 Thessalonians. And then we're almost to the summer, and I'll take off for a while. So let me turn this off, all right?